Good morning and welcome. My name is Manuel, and this is a short daily conversation about how to think, not what to think. I decided to start this because I realized there's a difference between wanting to do something and deciding to do it. I had wanted to do this for a very long time. This is me deciding to do it. This show is about thinking clearly, especially when emotions make that difficult. So, join me in taking a breath. Breathe in. Don't let the noise out there overwhelm you. And let's see what we can think about differently today. To begin with, if I might, I would like to say just a few words about what finally got me to this moment. And those two words are Scott Adams. 1 week ago today, Scott Adams passed away. And I, like millions of others, had been listening to him daily for many years. In my case, I'd say it was about 8 years. And that constant voice every day being suddenly gone, it hits you harder than you think. And there are many ways to deal with grief: crying, getting busy. Well, I'll simply say that I did both. And this is part of the getting busy. And so I'd like to go ahead and just say thank you to Scott Adams out there in the universe for all the lessons, for all the companionship, and always remembering what he said: be useful. And today, to be useful, there's a big, big old story in the news that's been making a lot of noise. And like I said, let's try to quiet that noise down. Let's think clearly about it. And there are so many that one could choose from. You're probably thinking, well, which one? There are so many. Well, here's a story that I never imagined over the years that I'd be talking about so much, and that's Greenland. Um, let's not mince words. There is a large segment of the population that has decided that President Trump is some kind of narcissistic sociopath devoid of morality, and or he has dementia, that he's lost his dang mind over this whole Greenland thing. So I have to laugh. A lot of people just dismiss this simply. They call it TDS. So let's frame this, okay? So those people, they're not responding to policy. They're responding to his character. So once someone labels another person, like I said, a narcissistic sociopath, the conversation is no longer about Greenland or NATO or diplomacy. It's about moral condemnation, which a lot of people, that makes them feel pretty good. There's a sense of moral superiority in that moment. But that frame, it blocks reasoning. It's an insult, right? It's not an actual cognitive observation. So let's see if we can separate Trump's style from Trump's signal. So Trump's style, as you know, is provocative, ego forward, deliberately abrasive, uses exaggeration as leverage. But the signal, and all these are true, is Greenland is strategically critical. True. Arctic access matters for U.S. security. True. China and Russia are competing there. True. NATO isn't pulling its weight. Absolutely true. The U.S. already subsidizes global security more than anyone. That's true. So what happens is then the people who are screeching about Trump's narcissistic sociopathy and his malignant narcissism and so forth, they're equating style with insanity. But that's not the reality. But as is often said, including by the late great Scott Adams, what happens is that we are looking at two movies on the same screen. So one of the things that they are all been out of shape about is the other day there was a viral message that he had sent when he talks about the Nobel Prize, and they noticed that he talks about that he's basically he wants to be the president of peace, but if that doesn't work well, so they take that as a indication that war is imminent. But what really is being done is that he's raised the perceived stakes. He's signaling, I'm done being polite. It's not about the prize, even though a lot of people focused on that. It's about permission structure. So if we translate that into everyday speak, what Trump was saying in that message is, if diplomacy doesn't reward restraint, I'll switch to transactional power. Now, you don't have to like it, but that isn't dementia. So people will point out and say, well, look, Manuel, don't you understand that we already have soldiers there? Yeah, you're missing the point. They'll say, Manuel, look, the U.S. military is already allowed to have as many troops there as they want. Okay? But that is what we might refer to as a static thinking era. Trump is not talking about access. At no point does he really mention access. What he's talking about is control over future constraints. Let's face it, treaties change, governments change, incentives change. For some reason, people always think that the way things are at the moment are the way things will always be. There's this view that somehow we're at the end of history. This has never been true. And so once you understand that there's a difference between owning versus leasing versus permission, none of these things are equivalent. And in terms of long-term power planning, you have to recognize that difference. That's just basic geopolitics. So the next thing that happens is that once people have determined that, well, this man is off his rocker, he's dangerous, they get into this whole thing about this is 25th Amendment territory. And this is the biggest tell of emotional reasoning. Ask this simple reframe question. If a different president said, Greenland is strategically vital and we should explore stronger control or ownership, would they still call them a sociopath? Almost certainly not. They would say things, if they were trying to sound intelligent, I assume, like, it's realpolitik, it's hard power, it's uncomfortable but pragmatic. Oh, or perhaps they might even say it's imperial but historically normal. Okay. The thing is, Trump's tone triggers reaction, not his idea. You see, those that are jumping up and down with their hair on fire, they aren't thinking what was said, only how it was said. That, my friends, is TDS by definition. And for the few of you out there who may not know what TDS is, that is Trump derangement syndrome. So, how would you respond, or how might you consider responding if you actually want to engage with somebody? Which I'm not suggesting you do or don't. That has to be a decision you make at that time. Number one, don't argue facts. That doesn't work. That I don't want to say it never works, but let's face it, if someone has TDS, the facts aren't going to work. And we live in an era where the facts don't really matter. They probably never did. So if I might suggest a reframe, you might gently say something along the lines like, you're reacting to Trump's personality, not the actual issue. If you strip away his tone and you ask yourself whether Greenland's strategic importance and Arctic competition are real concerns, if the same proposal came from a president you actually liked, would you still call it insanity? Or would it just be maybe uncomfortable geopolitics? In that moment, that will force self-reflection without confrontation, because we're not looking for confrontation. You have to consider the difference between wanting to bring light and wanting to bring heat. And I would not suggest to anybody that you bring heat, although some people, they seem to enjoy conflict, of course, and a lot of people, they just enjoy being a troll. But in the context of things, are you really advancing your goals? So, to sum it all up, what we're seeing is not dementia. I've noticed that more and more they want to throw around that word. I think that they got so bombarded by having to accept the truth about the former guy that now they want to apply it to the current guy. But it's not dementia, and it's not random chaos. You know, the president is not out of control. This is President Trump using grievance language as leverage. You see, they're responding to identity disgust, not policy. You don't have to approve of Trump's style to see that. And here's something I'd like to leave you with. In fact, if you like it, I suggest you write it down and really think about it. You see, people don't hate Trump because he's wrong. They hate him because he refuses to speak in the language that makes them feel morally superior. You'll notice I mentioned that sense of moral superiority earlier. This seems to be a key component of TDS. So the real question is whether nonviolent leverage, meaning things like economic pressure, diplomacy, security arrangements, the question is if those things are ever legitimate between allies when your long-term strategic realities change. You see, the U.S. already uses that kind of leverage all the time. Think in terms of trade, defense spending, or basic agreements. The disagreement seems to be where you draw the moral line, not whether the strategic concern is real. So if a future administration pursued expanded control or guarantees through negotiation rather than threats, would they still oppose it, or would the objection specifically continue to be about Trump's style? Friends, I really appreciate you being with me on this journey. I want to thank you for listening. And remember, think clearly and be useful.